as the pandemic was descending, I had History Camp 2020 on my calendar. I had my ticket for it, and I was like, I hope this thing doesn't get canceled. And to me, it was one of the great losses of March 2020. But now here we are doing awesome online stuff.
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you, we hated to. I was traveling. I went someplace. I bought like all the Purell I could, and I was coming back home. I was in the back of an Uber, and Carrie and I were talking, and we're just like, the problem was the venue, right? At a certain point, they're like, you can't do events here, so that made our decision. But we are going to be back next year. This year, as you may know, in addition to doing these weekly ones, we also have History Camp America on July 10. Let me welcome folks now that we're at 8. Hey, I am Lee Wright. I am the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston, and with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund. I'm the director of The Pursuit of History, the nonprofit that brings these History Camp discussions to you each week. We are excited tonight to welcome Scott Kisner. Scott is a longtime business columnist for the Boston Globe and the CEO of Innovation Leader, a publishing company focused on effective innovation, strategy, and R&D in large organizations. Scott has spent more than 2 decades as a journalist and contributing editor at Wired Magazine, Fast Company, Variety, the New York Times, Business Week, and other publications. His focus on how innovations that matter get introduced to the world has taken him to the White House, the Sundance Film Festival, the United Nations, and the research labs of Google, Disney, General Motors, Novartis, iRobot, and many other companies. Scott is the author of several books, including Inventing the Movies, which explores the challenge of bringing new ideas to a century-old, change-resistant industry, Hollywood. And his latest book, which we will be discussing tonight, Innovation Economy, collects his favorite stories from more than 2 decades, covering the startup ecosystem and its historic roots in New England. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Scott.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for that great introduction. It made my Thursday night.
Well, Scott, let's talk about an innovation that I think most people just take for granted as existing. But there's actually a monument on what Boston Common, right, to this. Let's talk about anesthesia.
Well, yeah, I feel pretty grateful for anesthesia whenever I have to go in, even for a minor medical procedure. And I call that monument, it's not on the Freedom Trail, the Ether Monument in the public garden. Most people don't notice it because they're paying attention to the swan boats or they're looking for the Make Way for Ducklings statue. Right. But, in the 1860s, you had Mass General Hospital already existed on Beacon Hill. Charles Bulfinch had built this amazing building for Mass General. It was kind of on the edge of the swampy Charles River at the time. They could get rid of all their medical waste and probably cadavers that they had worked on in the swamps of the Charles pretty easily. There still is this structure at the top of the Bulfinch building in Mass General called the Ether Dome because in 1864, you had the first successful demonstration that the gas ether, which mostly had been used by magicians and, traveling kind of circus shows at that point to sort of knock people out and make them goofy. They realized, okay, in the right dosage, you can render people insensible to pain, I think is the word on the ether, the term on the ether monument in the public garden. And so already in the 1860s, you have a city in Boston that has Mass General Hospital, is attracting lots of smart doctors. You've had Harvard University for a couple hundred years. You've had a public school system educating lots of people. And the one cool thing about the Ether Dome that I always tell people when they're visiting Boston is you can actually go into Mass General Hospital and ask people how to find it. It is still there. It's still used for medical lectures. There's a beautiful historic painting on the wall commemorating the first successful demonstration of ether and surgical anesthesia. And it's cool to sort of find those historic places that are not really on the beaten path, to me at least.
Well, I want to mention one of those or ask about one of those in just a second, but let's go back to Mass General. You go there and you see, I understand why they were called operating theaters, right? With assembled medical students and professionals, right? Looking down and watching.
Yeah. The seats are very steep. Everybody wanted to be able to kind of look down on what was going on and not be too far away. And then you have lots of natural light in the dome, because we're before the invention of the electric bulb. And when I occasionally do walking tours of Boston innovation history with my friend Bob Krim, we try to stop by the Ether Dome, and the one of the other stops kind of along that same stretch, which maybe we can talk about, is a place where Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell worked. So the guy who gave us incandescent light earlier in his career was working in Boston.
Well, I was just going to say, and Carrie and I actually were talking earlier today, many other cities would really focus on something like that, right, and celebrate it. I think few people, even who live here, know about this. So talk to us about their work, then where it was, and then the connections to Edwin Land, the early railroad, and so forth.
Okay, yeah, those are a lot of connections. I do think that, so much important revolutionary era history and abolitionist history, right? You just have the accretion of like a couple decades of really important stuff happening, in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And I do think that the science and innovation history of Boston gets kind of overshadowed by all of that. There was a building at 109 Court Street, which isn't really an address you can still find, but if you know where Boston City Hall is and the City Hall Plaza along Cambridge Street, there was a whole neighborhood that was called the West End that was demolished to create the new City Hall Plaza and the federal buildings there. And one of the buildings that they demolished was 109 Court Street, which I think of as one of the first co-working spaces or one of the first incubator spaces. The technology of the time in the 1870s, I think we're talking about, was the telegraph, right? We were in a big telegraph boom where they were stringing up telegraph wires all around the United States. And inventors at the time were thinking about, how do you get more bandwidth down those telegraph wires? How could you send more messages at a time? Alexander Graham Bell was thinking, gee, maybe you could send sound down those telegraph wires. And so this building, 109 Court Street, I think is one of the most important lost sites of Boston innovation history. It stood right near where this JFK Federal Building is. There's a little bit of a podium plaque that commemorates this building and what happened in there. But it was kind of a telegraph supply shop run by a guy named Charles Williams on the first floor. And then he rented space in the upper floors for people who were thinking about, how do we upgrade telegraph technology? One of them was Alexander Graham Bell, who at the time was a Boston University professor. And the other was Thomas Edison, who started his career in Boston. Most people forget that, before he became the Wizard of Menlo Park. He patented his first couple inventions, including a vote recording machine, for more accurate vote counting in like state legislatures and in Congress, which didn't take off at the time. I think nobody was interested in counting votes more accurately. So Edison had a falling out with his investors and wound up kind of leaving Boston in disgrace. But he did work in this building on Court Street, and there are stories of Edison, getting rid of his hazardous chemicals that he was using for experiments in these sewers in downtown Boston. He would kind of surreptitiously go and dump these hazardous chemicals into the sewer, and some of them he would lower down in like sarsaparilla bottles. He was very worried that they might explode, and he was in his 20s at the time. He didn't want to get in trouble,
right.
Blow up downtown Boston.
Yeah, that's a great story. And how interesting to think about. We've got this infrastructure called telegraphs. How do we better utilize that, right? How can we get more information about it? And then to say, here's a guy who's running a business built around telegraphs, and above it, basically providing a space for rent for people who might enable him to be more successful, right? As a telegraph operator. It sounds so familiar, I think, to all of us today, right? Albeit with a different industry. So why don't we talk about you've got some connections here to the early railroads.
Yeah, well, there's a physical connection that we can talk about with Alexander Graham Bell and his assistant Thomas Watson, where a lot of the early telephone connections were to that building in downtown Boston, in what today is Government Center. And so Charles Williams said, I live in Somerville. Maybe you could set up a telephone in my house. And so he had his telephone number was 1, that went from Boston to Somerville. I'm not sure if it's before Williams. I think it's probably before Williams had the phone in his house. They did a demonstration to show that telephony could be a long distance thing. And so they said, let's go over the Longfellow Bridge from Boston into Cambridge. And they went to this building on Main Street in Cambridge. It's kind of on the outskirts of Central Square. And it's today a building called Lab Central. It's a brick building. And Watson sat in that building and Graham Bell was in Boston. And they proved that you could talk over the distance of, it's probably 1.5 miles or maybe 2 miles at most. So that building, I mean, I think in Boston, if you don't knock stuff down like they did to 109 Court Street, it is going to get repurposed and repurposed and repurposed. So that building and the site that building is on was at one point really the first manufacturer of passenger railroad cars in America. So you had some entrepreneurs who, as the railroad was being built around the United States, said, this is obviously not going to be just for carrying cargo, but we're going to carry people, and we're probably going to want to carry lots of people to make it economically viable. And let's think about how we design comfortable but high capacity railroad cars. So you had this company that was called Kimball and Davenport on this site. That's before the first phone call demonstration. But then after the first phone call demonstration, the building winds up being Edwin Land's office and private R&D lab when he's building Polaroid, the pioneer of instant photography. Edwin Land also did some work on the camera optics for the U-2 spy plane. And, he had a lot of connections to the Defense Department that people forget about because all we remember are, shaking the Polaroid pictures at birthday parties.
Right.
And then I'm not sure if there was an era after Edwin Land, but today that building is full of biotech companies, basically, that kind of share a laboratory space in that very same building that one day Thomas Watson was in doing the long distance phone demo. So I love those layers that you see in Boston where, if a building isn't turned into a museum, right, and it doesn't get preserved in amber in a particular way, like the old State House, it's just going to get continually reused, and you're going to see those really cool different eras of usage.
There's a building not in Boston but in Worcester that I think is an interesting example too of the fact that we used to build a lot of physical things here, and that's Mechanics Hall, which is a gorgeous hall. And you look at that and you say, wait a minute, so this is called Mechanics Hall. The industrialists, right, behind these companies doing instrumentation and so forth, surely did extraordinarily well and wanted to make their town nicer, and so they built this huge, gorgeous hall. And when I was moving out here, and I'd hear on the radio something about Mechanics Hall, I just kind of imagined kind of a union hall with maybe a hardwood floor and some spilled beer and so forth. And then you find instead, right, it's the industrialists. It's the mechanic industrials. So why don't we talk a little bit about one of the big industries that we also kind of take for granted. I think people do know that shoemaking used to be big here in New England. I think we have maybe one shoemaker, maybe Alden Shoes out in Western Massachusetts. But why don't we talk about the birth of that industry, evolution of it, and then some of the links to today?
Yeah, I mean, shoemaking is one of those things where, I think, as soon as it became industrialized and there were machines to produce it, we not only had the shoemaking companies, but we had the companies that made the machines, that precision equipment to cut the leather and sew the leather together and attach it to glue it to the soles and just crank out lots of shoes. I love finding connections between stuff, as a newspaper columnist, right? I can't just write about the history and say, way back in 1864, this happened in Boston. There has to be some connection to the present. And so I remember going to a robotics demo, coincidentally on City Hall Plaza, which we were just talking about. And I ran into this company called Harmonic Drive. And they make kind of components for robots today. They make gears, these very precise gears that can get you incredibly precise movements in a robot, which is great, if you're if you're manufacturing something small, or if you're maybe doing robotic surgery, you want it to be pretty precise. And so I started talking about them, and they said, "Oh yeah, we used to be part of United Shoe Machinery up in Beverly." And I was like, I don't quite know what United Shoe Machinery is, but I started looking into it. And, lo and behold, there's this company was the manufacturer of shoemaking equipment in the 20th century, so much so that the government filed an antitrust lawsuit against them. And the one vestige of this company, they were up in Beverly. Their campus was called The Shoe. It was like a giant, it has turned into office space now up in Beverly. But the one kind of vestige of United Shoemaking is this company, Harmonic Drive, which is still around today. And the interesting note with Harmonic Drive is that their gears are in a lot of satellites, and they were also used in the lunar rover. So the first time we took a lunar rover to the moon and drove it around, this company's components were in it. And so at one point, Buzz Aldrin dropped by Harmonic Drive's office to sort of thank them for their work on the space program, and, signed a poster and everything. And so it's just cool to be able to, to visit a company today that's supplying gears to makers of robots. And a lot of their work, I think, is to national security agency, sure, and places like that, that they can't talk about. And it has a tie to this company that was like a giant of the early 20th century industrial era here.
That is a great story. I want to go to another one that perhaps didn't quite make the transition successfully, but for a while was just an astounding growth engine, and that's Edwin Land and his company.
Yeah, Polaroid, I don't write too much about the heyday of Polaroid in the book, but Polaroid was interesting in that when they went bankrupt and as they were being sold off for pieces, a lot of that filmmaking, the production equipment that was making Polaroid film when we all were using Polaroid cameras in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was really valuable, and it was still high-tech equipment, even 10 years ago. And it was interesting to me that you would see companies, first of all, Moderna, I think the site that they're using to produce mRNA vaccines is an old Polaroid site. I don't think they're using any of the equipment, but they're using the facility. And then you also saw some startups that were thinking about making solar panels that would use old Polaroid plants and old Polaroid equipment, and they were trying to kind of print out solar panels. And there's one other that I'm hoping will come to me, kind of another Polaroid reuse story. The last little bit of Polaroid was thinking about how we might carry. It was a company called Zinc, and they were thinking about how you might do color printing from a phone to a little handheld device. And so they had some technology that they had licensed from Polaroid to do kind of digital printing with zero ink. So all of the color crystals were embedded into the paper. And that was a process that Polaroid kind of invented in its last few years of life as Polaroid.
Very interesting. We'll go to another industry here that many people have a direct connection to, but probably don't know. Sometimes maybe at Valentine's Day and so forth, right? And that's candy. And there's Necco wafers, I believe, and so forth. And wasn't there recently a concern about the shortage of the little candy? So talk to us a little bit about that industry and the factory in Cambridge.
Yeah, I mean, almost anything, right, that was a successful product in America, you can find someone in Boston making it first. I think occasionally maybe you find somebody in Philadelphia or New York making it first, but with chocolate, you go back to the 1700s and there's somebody who sets up a chocolate mill and a chocolate production facility down in Dorchester. Necco, the company that you mentioned, I think was one of the first, I think their innovation was really one of the first candy making machines to kind of cut slices. I think you would produce a slice of hard that hard, chalky Necco wafer candy, and they could kind of cut it into regular slices and then wrap it up in a nice roll, like a roll of quarters. Necco did go on and also invented those candy conversation hearts that you were referring to. Necco, at one point, just in the city of Cambridge, there were 66 companies producing candy, which is amazing. You know, they were making not just Necco wafers, but squirrel nut zippers and sugar babies and sugar daddies and lots of our favorite candy. Necco eventually moved out of Cambridge up to Revere. The building that they left behind on Mass Ave, they had to power wash the walls because there was so much sugar after so many years on the walls, but they power washed all the sugar off the walls. And then Novartis moved in. And today it's basically the biggest R&D facility for the Swiss pharma company, Novartis. And I went to visit I tried to go visit the very last company that's producing candy at scale in Cambridge is owned by Tootsie Brands. And it's a factory just across the way from the old Necco wafer factory on Mass Ave. And they make the world's supply of Junior Mints, which is one of my favorite candies. And so what really happened was, you know, consolidation in the candy industry bought up a lot of these smaller companies. Some went out of business. Tootsie Brands is one of the consolidators, you know, buying this factory in Cambridge. They're based in Chicago. I was never successful at getting into the factory, unfortunately. I think they've had like a couple OSHA violations through the years. And so they're a little bit press shy, but it's still going strong. They make Junior Mints. They make sugar babies, sugar daddies, sugar mamas, anything that has sugar at the beginning of it and is made of caramel and gets stuck in your teeth. They do that there. And the woman who runs Tootsie Brands, like she's a bit of history in herself. You know, her parents, I think it was her dad her grandfather maybe started the company that invented Tootsie Rolls. And she still lives out in Wellesley. And she is the oldest CEO of a publicly traded company, Ellen Gordon.
That is great. That is great. Well, I want to go, we talked earlier briefly, and we won't go into much detail here, but I do think it's worth mentioning. Lots of people do know that at one point we made a lot of textiles in New England. I think people may not know that the British were adamant that they maintain a monopoly on that manufacturing capability. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how we ultimately set up a mill here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, industrial espionage, right? Like we went over to the UK and took notes on everything that was going on and smuggled it back over. And really that was the birth of stealing intellectual property was the birth of the textile industry in New England. I think a lot of times that gets swept under the rug. You know, today we're all angry at China and countries like that don't respect intellectual property. But you and I were talking before about, we had a great run of textile production. We had a great run of shoe production. Now most of that stuff is either done in the South or it's done in Vietnam and Thailand and China. And so New England went from being a kind of 1800s, 1900s manufacturing colossus to the stuff that, I think there's two things that are still surviving today. One is there is a lot of shoe design in Massachusetts. And you've still got companies like Converse, Reebok, New Balance, Puma, Rockport that are all designing their shoes here, but they're outsourcing production largely to Asia. New Balance still makes has a small factory, I think, up in Lawrence, just to be able to say they make some shoes in the United States, I think largely for government contracts. There was one, just as an aside on the shoe manufacturing stuff, because it's fun. And I was just researching this recently. I was talking to the great grandson of the founder of Saucony, the running shoe company, and he teaches at Boston College. And he mentioned that his great grandfather started the company that became Saucony in Cambridge in 1906. And the very first thing he did was he was taking scraps of carpet and turning them into slippers and selling them for 10 cents. They were called carpet slippers, and you wore them around the house, back before pandemic work from home when people were around at home. And there's now a startup, and I love this kind of circularity. There's now a startup called Artemis Design Company that I discovered that's in Boston and is making carpet slippers out of Turkish rugs. And Lee, they cost $268 for carpet slippers in the year 2021. And I don't think those are made in Massachusetts, but like that's a little bit of digression. I do think so. So we still have design here, production elsewhere, but we can talk about it if you want. The stuff that's being made here is super advanced technology today. It's robots, it's biotech drugs, it's 3D printing technology. And so we don't have as many manufacturing jobs, but I would argue there's a pretty healthy manufacturing economy that's still in the Boston area and to some extent elsewhere in New England, but largely concentrated, within the Route 495 belt.
We again, as we were talking earlier about kind of the evolution and what the key components were to get from those early days to where we are today. Do you want to talk about that? Some of the key milestones to have the success we have had in innovation?
Well, direct me if I'm not answering your question. I mean, like to me, there's like almost these layers of sediment that you needed to grow what we have today, right? And like layer number one was educational institutions, right? So we kind of lucked out that Harvard was started in 1636. We have the first public schools showing up in Boston. I don't know that the 1700s were like a great stretch for starting other universities, but then the 1800s, you have others, Boston University and Tufts and MIT in the 1800s. So education is the first layer. Layer number two is lots of scientists and inventors, some self-trained, but largely people coming out of those educational institutions. And then in the mid 20th century, you kind of have the professionalization of finance. People like Alexander Graham Bell, you had to luck out and either meet a wealthy person, or I think he married into a wealthy family, right? And his investors happened to be the parents of his wife, and that's handy sometimes. But in the 1950s, the kind of the post-war period, you have the creation of venture capital. Like literally, there was a guy named George Doriot who set up one of the first venture capital firms. And so that's the way to think about what happened in Boston, is that, education leads you to inventors and scientists and doctors like those at Mass General. And then the professionalization of funding these companies, giving, the MIT grads who started a company called Digital Equipment, giving them a couple $100,000 and saying, go build these computers that you've been imagining. That's what really gets you, huge companies. And we still see that kind of funding happening all around Boston today.
I think in the background, you've got a couple of things. One, maybe easier to see. Why don't we start with that over your left shoulder? Is there a story behind that?
Well, no, this is like, I bought this on eBay and lit it up just because it's an Apple IIe circuit board, and the first computer that I learned how to program on and got on the early pre-internet networks on was an Apple IIe. And so
the other shoulder, yeah.
Oh yeah, the other thing, which is a little bit smaller, this is kind of like a ball bearing gear that was actually printed out on a 3D printer as one piece. And so I think this gets us into the early 1990s, where you have university spinouts. This one was a company called Z Corp that were inventing the concept of 3D printing, literally putting a powder down and then putting glues down and doing it layer by layer. And, they figured out how to make some amazing stuff. And it's now led to a boom in companies that can print in metal and can print in ceramics and print in just about any material you'd want.
Yeah, indeed. Let's also talk about something that's enabling this program tonight, and that is the internet and some of the key companies. And I'll just add, folks who watch and join us many Thursdays. Lots of times our discussion may stop in the late 1700s or whatever. So tonight we are going to take it up into a little closer to the modern day. Do you want to talk about the creation of the internet, the role of some of the companies and organizations in the area here in New England?
Yeah, well, I apologize if I'm getting too close to the present day. I was going to try to keep it. I think we said like pre 1970s.
I think this would be appropriate, though.
Yeah, well, the you had this, you know, you had a classic company called Bolt, Beranek and Newman, which was really, you know, started as kind of an R&D shop with smart folks who graduated from MIT. I mean, that's a story of so many companies around here. Bose, professor from MIT, who wanted to build higher quality stereo speakers, and Bolt, Beranek and Newman did the acoustics, I believe, for the United Nations, and they were the acoustics consultants for Symphony Hall, and they were just very good at going into a space as it was being designed and making sure that it sounded amazing using lots of high-tech instrumentation and electronics. And they became one of, as the Pentagon decided to build this network called the ARPANET, which was the predecessor to the internet, they were really one of the prime contractors that got the call to build a lot of the, you know, the technical infrastructure for the ARPANET, which initially just connected universities like MIT and Stanford and other lesser universities. I think there were like 8 or 10 of them. So you know, Bolt, Beranek and Newman is where Ray Tomlinson worked, the guy who sent the first email. You know, and kind of had this idea of like, well, maybe we might want to message each other on these computers. And what's the format going to be? Like, oh, there's this @ sign on the keyboard that people don't use that often. So we can use that to separate your name with the computer that you log into, you know, which is we now call a domain. So Bolt, Beranek and Newman was pretty important. And then the other thing, which does, you know, a lot of the funding, right, for the development of the ARPANET came from the Pentagon. Right. And so there is this symbiotic relationship between Washington, D.C. and Boston, where you have the Pentagon and this group called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was like a top secret, you know, we're going to build the future, build the ARPANET, let's connect all these computers. But they just kept on sending money to Massachusetts, and almost every interesting company around here now has gotten some money from that. I guess it's actually called DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, from that DARPA group. Like if you've ever seen the robotic dog videos from Boston Dynamics, Boston Dynamics would not exist if it was not for DARPA funding.
Yeah.
And the other fun connection to the internet, and we should make sure we talk about NASA a little bit before we run out of time. But the other interesting connection to the internet is just MIT. After Tim Berners-Lee invented the web, he was working over in Europe at the European Particle Research Lab, which I think is on the border of Switzerland and France. He invents the web, and MIT is like, hey, you seem like a smart dude. Why don't you come over here and set up a web, like kind of the web standards agency at MIT. So yet again, like academia getting smart people to come, and while the web wasn't invented here, then this became a hub of how do we think about, what the future of the web is and how to keep it open and create a level playing field. And, he's an interesting guy, and it was fun to be able to go and interview him a few times.
I can imagine. Well, let's talk about NASA. And then I also want us to talk about the Freedom Trail for Innovators. So you want to start with NASA?
Well, yeah, I mean, I always hear, and whenever I hear a historical tidbit that ties into science and technology, I want to investigate it. And some of them are really hard to investigate. Like there's a story about digital equipment out in Maynard that they built a computer one time that was a total dud. And they got so frustrated that they heaved it out of a window into the mill pond that was outside of Digital's headquarters. And so that one I'm still trying to track down if that's true. But I had heard this story about Kendall Square that it was supposed to be mission control for NASA. And the story goes that it was supposed to be Cambridge, we have a problem, instead of Houston, we have a problem. But Kennedy was assassinated, and that spoiled everything. Kennedy wanted to set up mission control in Kendall Square, and he got assassinated. And then Johnson takes over and takes it to Texas. It turns out none of that is true. Like it makes for a great, Texas versus Massachusetts story. But the real NASA connections in Cambridge are that as NASA needed to develop the computers and guidance systems to safely get people to the moon, they were working with various MIT labs on those guidance computers. And as NASA was growing throughout the Apollo era, they did decide we're going to set up. They'd already chosen mission control in Houston, and Johnson was president of the Senate then, and so he exerted his pull to get mission control set up in Houston. They designated Cambridge as an electronics research center for NASA, and so they cleared a lot of land next to MIT in Kendall Square, thinking we're going to build a whole NASA campus. It's going to be amazing. They only built one building, and what happened is after Kennedy got assassinated, Johnson took over. They were slowly building this NASA center in Kendall Square. And then when Nixon became president, he did some major cutbacks at NASA. And the only NASA facility that has ever been shut down is the Electronics Research Center in Kendall Square. Some people say it's because Nixon was not a fan of Massachusetts and the Kennedys. You know, I don't think we voted for him in any of the elections he participated in. But the result of sort of NASA's plans for Kendall Square that didn't come to fruition was they raised all this land that eventually got turned into office buildings, you know, that today house Google and Biogen and, you know, a dozen other tech and biotech companies.
Well, that's for instance, I didn't know that story. We should put in a plug for Draper Labs, started by a MIT professor, and their GNC, Guidance Navigation Control Units, have taken every NASA mission that's gone to the moon there safely and back. So they've got certainly a very strong heritage. So talk to us about a Freedom Trail for Innovators.
Sure. Well, I mentioned earlier that just for kicks, my friend Bob Krim, who is a real historian and a professor at Framingham State University, he and I will occasionally do these walking tours where we bring people to some of these sites we kind of have discovered and want to celebrate. Like there's a house on Beacon Hill, I think on Cedar Street, where George Dorio, the first venture capitalist, used to live. And so we'll go by there, and we'll go by the sewer where Thomas Edison used to dispose of his flammable chemicals in sarsaparilla bottles. And so as we were doing that tour, it's hard not to notice that there are lots of plaques around Boston that commemorate, you know, this Revolutionary War general lived here, and this former governor of Massachusetts lived here, and there's very little that commemorates all of this science and innovation history. You know, you can go through Central Square with a fine-tooth comb, and you're never going to learn that the sewing machine was invented there. You know. And forget about more recent day stuff like, oh, by the way, Microsoft wouldn't exist if Paul Allen hadn't bought a magazine at Out of Town News in Harvard Square that introduced him to this new computer, the Altair. And he went over to his friend Bill Gates and said, like, we should write software for this computer. Like a lot of cities would say that deserves a plaque. And so I do have this idea that Boston and Cambridge need to get their act together and say, you know, there should be another version of the Freedom Trail that really celebrates all this science and technology innovation that's been happening over the last couple hundred years, because it's hard to find at other cities in the world, right? You know, Paris, London, sure, New York, sure, but like we are definitely in that level of just consistently decade after decade. Like, you know, Digital Equipment at one point was the second biggest technology company in the world. Polaroid, which we talked about, really inspired Steve Jobs, you know, to create a company that made consumer-friendly technology, right? That was easy to use. You didn't need the 100-page user manual. I mean, a lot of amazing stuff. iRobot has sold more robots than any other company in the world, you know, and there's a fun little strip mall in Somerville that was, you know, the original headquarters of iRobot back before and when they invented the Roomba robotic vacuum cleaner. So all of that stuff, I mean, some of it is not quite history because it's not 50 plus, 60 plus years old, but I do think it would be nice to find a way to acknowledge, you know, with some kind of walking tour and some kind of signage or I don't know what else we might do, but I'm open to ideas. So email me My email is easily findable if you have ideas. I did at one point use a mobile app to create this walking tour. And then that mobile app went out of business. And so I'm a fan of digital technology, but sometimes it's a little too evanescent. And actually, a plaque or a sign is a nice thing.
Well, indeed. And there are some very innovative things that have been done that make someone aware in a location that they had no idea, right? Something interesting happened here. Well, Carrie, do you want to join us and with you perhaps some questions? I think it may take just a minute or two. Here we go. There we go. The internet working.
It's working. All right. So can you tell us a little bit about the invention of the sewing machine? Was that adopted quickly? Did people like the idea? And how did it come about?
That's one that I'm like an inch deep on. But Elias Howe is the inventor. It happened in Cambridge. I believe there were some demonstrations where it was kind of like the Paul Bunyan versus the steam powered hammer of like, could this work faster than the fastest seamstresses of the day? But that's not one that I'm super deep on, unfortunately. Lee was asking me about stuff on my wall, though, and if we don't have other questions, we can talk about Technicolor, which is up there. That print, people forget Technicolor was actually a Boston company.
Why don't we talk about Technicolor regardless of other questions? Which one is it, Scott?
Well, this is an illustration. I was doing a story at one point for Business Week about the transition of the movie industry from film, shooting on film, to digital. And I wound up learning for that project and for a book that I was working on that Technicolor, the first company to really successfully introduce color in the movies with Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz, which both came out in the same year, was a Cambridge startup. And the reason it's called Technicolor, MIT at the time was known as the Tech, and two of the founders of Technicolor, which I think goes back to about 1919 or so, were MIT alum, and one was just a self-trained industrial engineer. And the thing that I love and is a little bit of lost history is their first headquarters of Technicolor, as they were developing the film processing technology and the cameras, was in a railroad car. And it said Technicolor on the side of it. And the reason was that they weren't sure where people were going to start making movies. Thomas Edison was down in New Jersey working on his very short movies. Some movies were being made in Florida at the time. And so their office and lab was in a railroad car, so they could basically hitch it to a train and send it anywhere that movies were being made.
That is, so I'm sorry, Carrie, let me just interject. I'm just assuming the railroad car does not exist, but wouldn't it be fun if it did?
I think it'd be an amazing museum. I do sometimes wonder, like, it probably has been scrapped, but that'd be a fun museum in Cambridge. Absolutely. For sure, because it was a company that eventually, wasn't really successful until they moved out to California, as that became the center of the movie industry. And Technicolor is still around today.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Carrie.
That's okay. All right, we will have just one question to wrap up. If you could tell people to visit one place in Boston next time they're in Boston, where would you send them and why?
That's such a great question. I mean, I do think of places that you can visit that are really set up to sort of have a science and technology kind of experience. The MIT Museum is probably the best. It's not super historical, but it has a lot of fun stuff, and it's right on the edge of the MIT campus. It's right near this candy factory, so you can track down the Tootsie Brands candy factory nearby. So I think that's the most visitor friendly. Maybe the second one would be there's a Museum of Medical Innovation that's right at Mass General that's open to the public. I'm not sure if it's open post-COVID yet, but that's pretty good as well.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you. This has been very interesting, and there's definitely a spirit of innovation in Boston and New England for many, many years. So that is fun to learn about. So we have a link in the chat to Scott's book. And if you are interested in that Freedom Trail for Innovators, he has it all listed out for you in the back of his book. So check that out in the link, and then you can go take that Innovators Freedom Trail. All right, couple of things. We, of course, have History Camp America coming right up. And if you haven't registered yet, you still have time to register and get your box of cool history swag. You can do that by June 30th to make sure you get the box in time for the event. You will still be able to order it after that, but it may not arrive in time. So go ahead to historycamp.org and you can register there. And next week, July 1st, we will have Nancy Rubin Stewart with us. And she's going to be talking about two revolutionary women, Lucy Fluker Knox, Henry Knox's wife, and Peggy Shippen Arnold, Benedict Arnold's wife. So join us for that and have a good night. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. See ya.